You regulate your friends or vassals by either creating accidents or by using lawfare, as they did recently in Romania. So where the Romanian presidential candidate was on very flimsy legal grounds was pushed aside. So this is how you regulate your NATO allies or vassals. And then when it comes to your pure enemies, you continue to have a policy of confrontation with these, and you continue to create fear within your allied nations amongst the public.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Mazze Nielsson, one of the hosts of Sweden's Dissident podcast, to give us an update about where his country and the Nordics in general stand in geopolitics. Mazze, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure and an honor to be invited to your show.
I'm glad to have you because you are one of the alternative voices in Sweden that also tries to tackle difficult questions. But before we get into the most difficult part, let's maybe start with in general where Sweden is today, being 2 years beyond giving up neutrality, 200 years of foreign policy, and throwing itself into the loving arms of NATO, where now you must be completely safe, right? Sweden must feel very safe now, and you must be protected from all negative feelings of being under threat, because now you're safe, right?
Yes, of course, definitely. Every morning I wake up and I feel especially safe. Or leaving the sarcasm aside, I would say quite the opposite is true. The day that this podcast is being recorded is the day when Poland and the Polish military has officially confirmed that it has shot down drones over its territory. Now, had I been a Swede living in the neutral Sweden, we of course would have wanted to find out where were the drones fired from? Was it an intentional attack by, in this case, Russia? Or was it an unintentional wandering of drones? Or was it perhaps a Ukrainian false flag? However, now that Sweden is a member of NATO, we could potentially be dragged into an Article 5 against Russia in a battle and in a war where we don't really have a stake in any sense, way, or form. So, no, obviously, Sweden has not become safer by by us entering NATO, and it was a very quick process. It was a process where the politicians used the fact that I think a certain amount of people, myself included, actually, were quite shell-shocked at the fact that Russia invaded the oblasts in Ukraine under, of course, under a correct assumption that Ukraine was gearing up to start attacking its own citizens in a way that was way beyond what was necessary. But still, Sweden and the Swedish populations were quite shell-shocked at this. And then the political shenanigans started. It wasn't a huge step. The Swedish political, within the circles of the Swedish political elites, and especially within the Swedish military and security agencies, we had been in cahoots with NATO since the late 1950s. It's not a huge secret that Sweden colluded with NATO during the Cold War. This was, however, known to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union accepted this as a known unknown, so to speak. But Finland, however, Finland was strictly neutral during the Cold War, and with the Finnish shift, Sweden was kind of dragged along. So the Social Democratic Party, who was in power at the time, were quite skeptic. However, they were basically just hung out to dry when the Finnish politician or then Minister Sanna Marin, the Prime Minister of Finland, said that NATO is joining, consequences be damned. And without asking the population, there was no referendum on giving up Swedish sovereignty after 200 years. Both Sweden and first Finland and then Sweden applied for membership, which of course was no surprise, but the politicians were quite savvy the way they used the shock within the population, because Russia has always been something to scare the Swedes with. You have to remember that aside from Denmark, Russia is the country that Sweden has had the most wars with. And since we have befriended Denmark, mind you, I don't trust the Danes, but still, I mean, they're at least semi-friendly these days, so I wouldn't count them as a threat tomorrow. However, Russia, you can always use Russia to scare the Swedish population, because within the time frame of the mind, you can still perceive Russia and the Soviet Union, since these are intermingled in the Swedish psyche. You can still perceive these countries as one and as a threat. So the governments and the powers that be in Sweden were quite efficient in creating the perfect fear storm, which allowed us to enter NATO. But I think now there is a backlash when Swedes realize that we're going to have US bases on Swedish soil. Our conscripted soldiers might be obliged to go down to Poland and fight, or wherever they are needed if NATO calls. So the Swedish population, they weren't ready. They didn't really know what to expect. They're now learning what to expect, and there will be a backlash. But as you know, it's kind of like the Roach Hotel. Once you check into NATO, you never check out.
In
So
Germ sorry, just in Germany, what we are seeing at the moment is quite a frenetic remilitarization frenzy. At least politically, there's a lot of talk about remilitarization, and we need to conscript people again into the Bundeswehr and so on. Is this also happening in Sweden? Is the fear mongering continuing to the point where the process seems to be pointing toward more military, more expenses, more the drafting of people?
yes, most certainly, most certainly. Sweden, I think Germany followed Sweden in this. We actually let conscription go a few 15 or 20 years ago, but it was reintroduced after only, I think, 8 to 10 years, and it was reintroduced three years ago now. Three
So
or
right
four,
after,
yeah, right around about when we entered NATO. So this is, of course, done in order to facilitate our ability to rebuild the Swedish military structure. You have to remember then that when it comes to military industrial profit, Sweden is second to none. We have the Wallenberg industries, which have, during the Cold War, Sweden was able to at its peak, put 800,000 men under arms with a sizable fleet and air power added to that. We produced our own planes. We produced our own submarines. And, being a small country such as Sweden was, it was quite a feat, which of course was helped by the fact that we were unscathed by the Second World War. But still, so these companies are still working in the background and are gaining a huge market right now. If you had stocks in the Swedish weapons and arms industries, you will be quite happy today. So Sweden is definitely rearming, and Sweden is creating an enemy out of Russia in order to uh, allow for this rearmament, because people are rightly complaining, as in every Western nation, They're complaining about the declining state of the healthcare. They're declining about the declining state of the social security apparatus, and of course about other social issues, which Sweden once upon a time also was a world leader in. I think you might remember the Swedish welfare state. You were always looked after from the cradle to the grave. You never had to fear being put out on the street, or you were, the idea was that you were taken care of. Now, the netting on this social welfare state in Sweden has become, it's easier to fall through and that is also a combination of internal policies. However, one can see the rearmament, and I think Sweden might actually be heading up back to the Cold War level of funding the military. We might be going back to a 4% or 4.5% of GDP, if not even a 5% level on the GDP, such as is asked by us from our American hegemon over in Washington.
Yeah, so now what we are seeing is that, okay, we have now more NATO members who collectively feel less secure, and all of them will gear up for more military expenditures and potentially adventures in the future. And all of this, of course, happening under the guise of creating security. But do you see at the moment also a counter movement in Sweden? Because okay, I'm from Switzerland, and Switzerland is on a different path. Is also still, like, at least on paper, neutral. They didn't join NATO, at least, but also there we saw how the shock was pretty deep. But it is easing out now, in a sense that some people are putting things into this perspective again, especially now also seeing how the West supports a genocide in Gaza, and how our leaders that are so vocal, so extremely vocal about the crimes of Russia, are basically mostly, not totally, but mostly silent in order not to burn their fingers with Gaza. How is it in Sweden?
It's much the same, very much the same. Uh, there is not much of a counter movement in Sweden. We at the Dissident Club, we do our best. We try to, how shall I put it, work in a sense of guerrilla media. We try to counter some of the more blatant misconceptions that come from the Swedish mainstream media and public service by using our channels. Of course, we are but nothing, but at least we try. Now, there's one good example concerning Gaza and Ukraine, Russia. On Swedish television, we have a program called 30 Minutes. Now, that's when a guest comes and they're able to have a conversation uninterrupted with the journalist for 30 minutes on prime time Swedish public television. On this show has been invited, of course, the Ukrainian ambassador and also the Israeli ambassador. Now, of course, there has been discussion about the Israeli ambassador, but it was it was benign. It was critiqued, but he survived it. 2 days ago or 3 days ago, 30 Minutes told us that next week the Russian ambassador, Ambassador Belayev, is going to go on 30 Minutes. And the backlash has been massive. I mean, there is a cultural debate, there is a debate in social media, there is a discussion within the newspapers. Can you really have the Russian ambassador tell his propaganda on Swedish public television? I mean, obviously you can, because you've had the Ukrainian and you've had the Israeli ambassadors tell their propaganda. But it's somehow like as if, Ukraine and Israel, they don't use propaganda. No, no, no. They use facts to explain their position. But as soon as it comes to the Russian ambassador, it's propaganda. It's evil. You can't allow him to tell his position. Now, this is the only reason that people act this way is that ingrown fear of anything Russian, which has been cultivated in Sweden, as I referred to before.
Yeah, and that of course what comes from these people must be wrong and must be propaganda, must be said in bad faith. Okay, so overall we're still dealing even in let's say the periphery, like not the core German, France, Italy, Britain states, but even in the others we deal with a very high level of fear mongering, a very high level of propagandistic environment. But if we turn to the political side, I mean, Sweden in the Cold War, and this is one of your fortes, was of course one of the non-conformist European states. Not only was it not a NATO member, but it also had a social democratic leader, a famous one and a very popular one, Mr. Olof Palme, who didn't go along with the United States, and at some point there was even you even had interruptions of diplomatic relations with the United States, if I remember correctly. But Olof Palme, in many respects, also when it comes to Palestine, had a very independent foreign policy. Um, can you tell us a little bit about that history of Sweden, how it ended, and how it transformed into this very obedient, being part of the club policy of today?
Yes, I think I'm not old enough to remember the early years there for Olof Palme, but it's probably been quite a journey for at least my my parents' generations, the generation that was born during the 1940s, uh, to have seen this. Sweden was, as you say, um, an independent voice, a third party voice. I think it was involved with the Bandung movement during the neutrality years, so to speak. Then, of course, as I said, we were connected to the NATO sphere. We had the cooperations that were unofficial all through this Cold War. But Olof Palme, he started out as a very huge fan and friend of the United States. This has to be reminded. He studied in America. He gained a law degree. He was a very smart man, and he quickly gained a law degree in America. However, Olof Palme was one of these few politicians who was able to keep two conflicting thoughts in his head at once. So this is what led to the confrontation with America during the Christmas bombings of Hanoi in 1972, 73. I can't remember the exact year, but somewhere thereabouts, where Olof Palme realized that his America wasn't really the America that he knew and that he respected. So that's when he together with the North Vietnamese ambassador to Sweden went was seen with him walking in a torchlit procession against the terror bombings of Hanoi during the Christmas that Christmas. And this, of course, infuriated America for a number of reasons. One, of course, a Western-ish leader was officially protesting America. Two, they had seen Olof Palme as an ally and as a friend. Now, the reasonable reaction to this would have been looking inwards and saying, "Ooh, if one of our supporters is this mad at us, perhaps we should maybe change our policy on terror bombing Hanoi." Obviously, this is America. They never apologize. It's USA, fuck yay. So they withdrew their ambassador and it caused a diplomatic stir. But Olof Palme, he persisted in this, which he rightly did. Now that this is compared to now, the politicians should have been able to do the same with Israel and say, Israel, we respect you. You have this democratic-ish way of dealing with your country and running your country, but right now you are way out of line. No leader in Europe is, of course, there's a variety. I mean, some Spanish and Irish leaders have come out quite forcefully against Israel, but basically, there has been no Olof Palme walking alongside the Palestinian protesters in Europe, which they should be able to do. So I think this was Olof Palme's strength. He was able to accept America and, be a supporter of America, which I think a lot of Western people are because they have loved the American soft power. But he was able to, in time, criticize America for what they were doing. And he went on to do this. And in the 1980s, because he lost power, he was voted out of office for a period of 6 years, between 76 to 81, I think. And then he returned to power. And when he returned to power, he once again started to enter into de-escalatory talks with the Soviet Union. And this was a time when tensions were heating up. This was during the early 80s, between 82, 83, 84, when you had all those more or less dying fellows entering the Soviet leadership, Andropov and these very old, feeble men. And then you had that nuclear scare. I can't for the life of me remember the incident, but when the Soviet Union actually believed that they were being attacked, perhaps you remember the.
I I don't remember that one, but I do remember talking to Ola Tunander, and in 81,
Ah,
I think it was when the submarine scare started in Sweden, right? Whiskey on the
yes, yes,
rocks.
yes, exactly.
When but maybe I'll let you explain it.
No, no, Whiskey on the Rocks was officially it was a Soviet submarine that uh, entered the South Sweden archipelago in Blekinge. Uh, it was believed they were going to pick up Soviet divers who had been there. Uh, but it was quite obvious that a submarine of this size didn't by mistake enter, or they would never go on a mission this deep within Swedish territory. So first it was a navigational error, but Professor Tunander has, in a very, very good way, together with a few other researchers, pointed to the fact that one of the military Soviet officers was probably in on running this Soviet submarine aground.
Mhm.
In order
The
to
important
in
thing,
order
it
to
ran
create.
aground, it got
Yeah,
stuck, and it was seen and it was photographed, and
yeah,
that's when Sweden again like was shell shocked back in the 80s of like, oh my
yeah,
God, the submarines. And from there on, stories about submarines kept creeping up because there were sightings, right? Again and again. And the Soviets said, like, it's not us. And the Swedes said, so of course it's you, up to the point where the Soviets said, good, shoot them down, take
yeah,
them out, please.
yeah.
And Sweden never did. And
No, Sweden never did, and it's been by Professor Trunander as well. It's been quite heavily researched, and I would say it's beyond reasonable doubt that these submarines were, in fact, German or British. NATO had a deal with Sweden that they could go in on practice runs within the Swedish archipelago. And there, Ola Thunander is better at this, but there are stories where the then Admiral Bror Stephenson, actually, stopped using submergible bombs because he was one of the few people that know that this wasn't a Soviet sub. So during an incident in Hårsfjärden, where the Swedes let loose, they actually were ordered to not do it, and this submarine was able to leave, and it was probably a wounded German submarine or British. I think maybe in 70 years' time we will know what kind of submarine it was, but it wasn't a Soviet one. So the Swedes were scared. The Swedes were once again ramping up its defense industry. But Olof Palme was still going to go on a visit to the Soviet Union to try and create a sea of peace around the Baltics. Because then Finland and Sweden were neutral, so both these countries, together with the Soviet Union and Germany and Denmark, could be able to create a sea of peace. Now, as soon as the word peace pops up anywhere in the West, I'm sure there are alarm bells going off somewhere in a subterranean bunker under the Pentagon. And just a few weeks before Olof Palme was going to go to the Soviet Union, he was killed. He was assassinated. And this working for a dialogue with the Soviets, I mean, he wanted to have a new security architecture that was called a common security and that recognized security concerns on all sides. Uh, and you have to assess the fact that the Swedish chief of counterintelligence at the time, one Olof Frånstedt, described Palme as a Soviet agent of influence. And I think that the then CIA chief in America, James Angleton, also referred to Palme as someone who was a danger to this.
Now,
So the fact is that it's more than likely, because no one has ever been charged. Well, someone has been charged with the murder of Olof Palme, but if you look at the evidence from a lawyer's perspective, which I have done, it just doesn't pan out. The whole story behind the assassination of Olof Palme, it doesn't fit. So
what is officially known? Can you tell us what happened and what is known, or what is officially believed?
Well, first, it was believed that it was this semi-alcoholic person called Christer Pettersson, who by chance saw Olof Palme head into the movie theater, was mad at him for some reason or another, and then got this gun and shot him. So he was put on trial, but he was released from trial. He was released, and it was deemed that he was not the killer. And then, of course, nothing happened.
Excuse me, just so because we are not familiar with this, I'm not. Olof Palme was shot to death in a movie theater.
Sorry. Yes, I, I've lived with Olof Palme as a Swede for so many years, so I'm making assumptions. My apologies. In 1986, Olof Palme, the then Prime Minister of Sweden, on the 28th of February, at I think it was 11:30, he was shot dead in central Stockholm after having been to the cinema with his wife.
In the evening.
So in the evening at night, 23:20, I think he was shot. He was shot at a close distance. It was just 20 centimeters, and the bullet, a Magnum revolver, just went through his aorta and spinal cord. And it was a bullet that could have penetrated a bulletproof vest. So it was a highly professional operation, basically. Now, several witnesses saw the killer and were able to describe his clothes, but he disappeared and was never found. And then the police investigation started, and they followed different tracks. They thought that the Kurds were involved, that the South Africans were involved. But then the police landed in a suspect that was a man who was a violent alcoholic. And the whole police investigation, and this is official. The official commission inquiry has from the beginning said that the police investigation was unprofessional. But at least they found this violent alcoholic. They put him on trial. He was acquitted. And then 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, a dead man was essentially put on trial. It was a fellow that's referred to as the Scandia man. He was a person with an interest in guns who worked in the building just beside the place where Olof Palme was physically shot. but I mean, the dead man, he was just a bureaucrat who had supposedly had a gun and happened to meet Palme. I mean, the inquiry itself actually looked into him, but they didn't really see him as someone of interest. But he is still now officially the person who killed Olof Palme, and since he's dead, he can't appeal. So it's a kind of a strategic legal shenanigan in order to get the case closed, because the everything points to the stay behind networks in Europe, that they were involved. And when I say everything points to, it's everyone who looks at this with a dissident view can clearly see that it was a professional operation.
It's one of these moments when a politician who already has a lot of enemies, a lot of powerful enemies, then gets killed by a lone nut. It's like happens time and
Yeah.
again, right? And every time we're told that this is normal. This is just what happens. The gunmen, they just happen to show up on some rooftops and be completely uninvolved with anyone and try to shoot at at a wannabe president of the US. A gunman just show up and lone wolves just show up and shoot the president of the US, John F. Kennedy. That just happens. It's normal, and it has nothing to do with any form of government government involvement. But so for Sweden too, we have these very strong suspicions of the actual story of how one of the most dissident leaders of the time actually had to leave the stage.
Yes, it did. And you mentioned of course Kennedy, and you can also Dag Hammarskjöld was also one of those who was more than likely removed because he was inconvenient. And I think you shouldn't forget the assassination attempt to kill the French President de Gaulle. I mean, he also pushed for a European de-escalatory policy and a collaboration with the Soviet Union back in the days. And there were also there was this fellow called
Enrico
a
Mattei, yeah,
director.
Italian, yeah.
Yes, Italian. He was a director of the Italian oil company, Eni. And he started to collaborate with the Soviet Union from the 1960s, and he challenged U.S. oil and UK oil companies. He was killed back in '62, and then you had all these Red Brigades working in Italy and going after certain political individuals, and there was also the chief of Deutsche Bank, Alfred Herrhausen. He was also working with the Soviets to finance a German-Soviet pipeline, just like Mattei had done in 20 years before. And if you remember, he was also assassinated.
And he was
So
assassinated by officially kind of communist inclined. He was the army brigade, right? That
yeah, exactly.
group.
Which were financed or supported by the Gladio, the stay behind networks, according to some dissident view. So it's not open and shut. And I mean, even Willy Brandt himself, who founded the Ostpolitik, he was dethroned because of he had a spy working within his chancellery. But this spy had been known for at least a year, and that was kept a secret in order to harm Willy Brandt so much that he had to resign. So there are always different layers and levels of working against people who go against the Western narrative or the Western economic interests.
Yeah, or at
Now,
least
so yeah.
even if they are not, even if that's just a conspiracy, even if they are not officially taken out by Western and US aligned forces, then at least we have a pattern of very strong misfortunes to people who try to work for a common security sphere with the Russians in Europe. I mean, then it's just common unluck that befalls them. But where does that leave us, and how did that then with the end of the Cold War, basically lead into this very obedient European, not only obedient, but really satellite existence? How did that transform? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think really nothing changes. I mean, the focus on certain policies remain the same in the West, no matter who is in power, so to speak. And I think this goes back to the historian in me. It goes back basically to the Boer War, where there was the first time where you could see in the modern era, where you could see a group of politicians, industrial men, and media personalities create the fabrics for starting a war. The second Boer War was basically started due to fear-mongering in the Times and what was in essence a false flag in South Africa in order to be able to let the British troops go back into South Africa and, gain the control of the wealth and resources that the Boers then had as an asset. Then came the First World War, which when you look into it and you look at the movements, at the available documents, you can see that there was a push to create a war already in 1912 with the fleet incident in Tunis concerning a German ship and Italian and British, but that was de-escalated. But they were always looking and pushing for this spark, and I'm talking about mainly the British now, because they did not want competition from the Germans. Now, once the Germans has been pacified, you can always look to history and see that the British have always had a thorn in their side towards the Russian and Chinese continent, because this land mass could potentially threaten their navy power, their global power, which runs by the sea. If Russia and China and India, God forbid, from a British point of view, were to be united, it would be detrimental to certain industrialists and people in power within London and today also Washington. So I think it's always been a British focus to continue the policies of dismembering and dismantling and picking apart the Russian Empire, which is basically happening today. I mean, it was clearly done so during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, you succeeded in partly dismembering the Russian Empire when you divided the Soviet Union. And I think one of the American politicians, the more hawkish ones, if it was the former Vice President Cheney or if it was Pompeo, I can't remember. One of them said that the mistake was not to having dismembered Russia even more when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so I think that this thread with creating accidents for dissident Western politicians and continuing a warlike rhetoric in relationship to Russia, but also any other country outside the Western sphere of influence that dare oppose them. It's something that runs no matter the politician in charge. So you regulate your friends or so-called friends, so you could also use the word vassals. You regulate your friends or vassals by either creating accidents or by using lawfare, as they did recently in Romania. Where the Romanian presidential candidate was on very flimsy legal grounds was pushed aside. So this is how you regulate your NATO allies or vassals. And then when it comes to your pure enemies, you continue to have a policy of confrontation with these, and you continue to create fear within your allied nations amongst the public. And as I've seen it from a historical vantage point, reading books from the different eras along from the late 19th century onward, it's quite obvious that no matter the social democratic or Christian democratic politicians in charge, it's always been the same thread coming out of the home of the Western Empire. And that has been a policy of confrontation and definitely not neutrality or diplomacy. I'm very sad to say.
Yeah, but I share that assessment. I mean, I had a discussion earlier today with Jeffrey Sachs, and he points out that the right way of actually trying to create peace is by thinking in spheres of security, that you need borderlands, you need cordons sanitaires that are shared. They don't need to be disarmed, but they need to be no man's land in the sense that they do their own thing and make sure that this side doesn't threaten that side and that side doesn't threaten this side, and put physical space in between. And Sweden was part of that. Finland understood that maybe even more than Sweden, that they are responsible to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't feel threatened from its flank. Yugoslavia was part of that. Austria, Switzerland are to a lesser extent, but still. And we've had that, of course, in the 19th century, and we see how today it seems that it is a matter of course that countries as distant from the United States as Ukraine are considered spheres of interference for the United States, right? Places where they legitimately can and must and should change politics, including elected leaders like Viktor Yanukovych, by making sure that things happen that chase them out. And we know by now that the Maidan itself, the people who shot at both sides, were shooting from the protesters' side, but they shot at both of them in order to create the political cloud to make sure that this president can stay on. So I mean, there's this history, and you're pointing that out absolutely correctly. It goes more than 100 years back of trying to foment this type of mass violence in order to fight against others. And Brian Berletic would call that the continuity of agenda over time. It
Yes.
doesn't matter.
Yes.
But you're pointing out it's not just it's not just the United States. This has been done by the Western powers, the Anglo-Saxon powers, and it was the British first, and they handed over the staff to the US, and they are continuing that very long, basically civilizational Western trajectory of trying to dominate everybody else. Is that about it?
Yes, that's about it. You summed it up perfectly, and that's what we're sadly suffering from. The thing is that I'm a huge fan of borders, because borders are needed for the security and the feeling of security within how to regulate relations on a global scale. And I think you have many examples of this, and also this reason for having security agreements, it's much needed. I think Austria is a prime example of this with the Vienna Agree. Was it in the convention of from 53?
The diplomatic convention, the Vienna Convention.
No, not that one. But when the Soviet Union and the Western powers agreed that Austria would remain neutral.
So it was since it was mainly occupied by the Soviets. It was in 55. It was an agreement with the Soviets,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Moscow Memorandum.
Yes, that's the one. And that's also one of these agreements, which I've always said should have been early on a blueprint for Ukraine.
Yeah.
You could have used that. You could have used the same principle on Ukraine, and you would have saved all these lives. Because I always work from the primary My primary point of view is, how do we achieve a situation where the least number of civilians have to suffer the consequences of war? Uh, that's my baseline. And there, I think borders play an immensely important part. I don't particularly, enjoy a situation like Cyprus, where this beautiful island is separated by a green line and a border. However, in order to eventually achieve peace, this border is necessary because now the Greek and the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots, they both feel safe. They don't have to fear being attacked by, Greek terrorists or vice versa. And they can start interacting again across this border and start making new agreements on how to open this border and so on. And it's the same in any country. Sometimes, sadly, it's done by way of a very bloody war, like the question of Pakistan and India, which was also basically cleansed of the different religious affiliations, and then you put a border between the countries, which also, for all intents and purposes, have kept a peace-ish situation between these countries. I mean, had the populations been remained intertwined in one nation, there never would have been any security, and you would have had a perpetual kind of civil war until you created these borders. I mean, borders are not per definition evil. As a
No.
cosmopolitan, they are good.
Though they can, the counter argument is, of course, that you had these populations living with each other for centuries and they didn't kill each other. So something happened, and it's
Yes.
usually nationalism that happens that then
Yes.
makes neighbors turn against each other. But this is one of the things that happens, especially on the Eurasian continent, time and time again. It happens in the East, it happens in the West. It happens in the Balkans, right? But it can
Yep.
happen everywhere because we are so intermixed. It's the languages that are intermixed, the ethnicities. It is the habits and the different religions that are intermixed. There's so many fault lines that can break up and make neighbors into enemies. Sorry, I just wanted to add that so that we don't come across as saying like all of the ethnicities have to live in neat little
No,
ethno-national states. That's not what's needed.
no,
But
no, no, no,
borders
they don't.
can have a healing effect. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look for, and then politics are used to uh, erupt conflict along aestheticity or feeling of belonging. For example, the southern part of Sweden, where I'm from, since time immemorial, basically, was for a long time a part of Denmark, and it wasn't until 1658 that Sweden finally gained total control of these areas, and they entered into a very brutal Swedification of these areas. Now, 1658, it's not that long ago. I mean, if you look down into the Balkans, they are fighting over territory, or were fighting over territory that was ceded, I mean, back in the 14th century. So if one wanted, one could probably create a situation of uh, Denmark wanting their lost territories back if you really wanted to work for that politically. So I mean, it's the politics using these ideas of cultural identity and using that together with created borders in order to gain certain advantages, which is blatantly obvious in Ukraine, which, given its history, is, I would say, you can argue, two or even perhaps three countries in one that would perhaps be a lot happier and would perhaps be able to develop within a peaceful framework if you would have just sat down, had a diplomatic agreement like the conventions of old. You remember the old conventions that was agreed upon after the Napoleonic Wars, or over the 30 after the 30-year war.
Mhm.
Everyone sat down, you redrew the borders, and you said, okay, we might not like this, but for the time being, this will be a good way to solidify our nation and our people. It, had this been done in 2014, so much would have been saved. I think it was Churchill who said that jaw is always better than war, in the essence that diplomacy and talking is always better than picking up the guns and trying by force to change these borders.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is not the kind of mindset, again, that the people in who run the show
No,
actually have.
no, no,
That's
no.
the mindset of people of people like us, right? Who would want to see stability and prosperity for everybody, but that doesn't
And
come with
no, and
dominance.
we are sadly not in a position of power.
It doesn't come with dominance. But the just one more thing. Ukraine, the name Ukraine itself in Slavic, Slavic and the Russian Ukrainian Slavic actually refers or alludes to borderland. It means even border in
Yeah.
its origin. And borderlands should be bridging lands, right? Bridging borders and not wall borders. But this mentality that we are unfortunately in, of this Western civilization, tends to always go toward all or nothing and then create the walls instead of the bridges. Now, where does this leave us today if we bring it back to the Nordics, to Sweden and Finland, to these 15 and 17 bases that are now going to be or are already erected on your soil, to the militarization of Sweden and Finland? What are you perceiving where the NATO is taking your country, let's say Sweden?
Thankfully, the DCA agreement has yet to be implemented in Sweden. That is, we have no American bases in according to the DCA agreement. I think Finland has one that is being opened now. However, it's been said that in the central or south central city of Enköping, there will be a strategic supply base placed, because Sweden has been designated to be a forward supply base for military materials being sent to Finland and the Baltic states in case of an open conflict with Russia. Obviously, making us a very juicy targets for different kinds of Russian missiles. So that is where we're at right now. No American troops as of yet, given the fact that Trump is withdrawing forces, so I don't think they will build a new base in Sweden. However, we're gaining the dubious pleasure of hosting NATO bases, and the discussions are ongoing.
But this is good news, and I wasn't aware that the United States is actually not implementing the agreement, because the agreement has also been ratified in Sweden, right? It went through Parliament.
Yes.
So the Americans now have the right at any point in time to open these bases that they agreed with you upon, but they're not actually doing that. Can you maybe give us a little bit more detail?
Of course. Yeah, no, in line with Trump declaring that America is decoupling slightly from the Europe theater of conflict, there has been no demands or no discussion concerning any of the 17 bases that stipulated in the Swedish agreement that America wants to send any permanent troops to these bases. It's only Finland who, in one of its, I think they had 14 bases, perhaps. It's one of these 14 bases where American troops will, under the DCA agreement, be placed. But Sweden is so far, thankfully, not affected by American military men doing drunk driving around the roads in Sweden, not at least not within the foreseeable future, which I'm of course very happy about.
This is something to look out for, actually, because now if this changes, please do let me know, because this would be an indicator that something is being geared up for. If the US at the moment is withholding it's military, then that does point towards some form of restraint on their part. Because if they wanted, they would have opened these already very quickly, right? It's like you bring in the stuff, you start having people
Yes.
sleep in these barracks, and then you build from there. Okay, that's a sign for something to look out for.
Yes, most definitely.
Good. Thank you very much, Mats. For people who want to read or hear more from you, where should they go? In Swedish and in English, if you have outlets for both?
Yes, I would say that in Swedish it's Dissident podden. It's our Substack page, the Dissident pod. And just for me, I'm basically I publish in Swedish periodicals, but I also have a slightly large X account which I manage, which is just at Mazze Nilsson, just my name into one. So that's where they can find me on my X account, and from there they also can find all my other venues that I have. But as I said, in Sweden we're basically doing guerrilla media, but someone has to do it.
Somebody has to. I'm glad you're picking up the work on this one. Mazze Nielsson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Professor Lottas.